The screams echoing through the holding pens of Carathon Station had long since become background noise to Warlord Vex Thul. His forearms gestured dismissively as another batch of Terran prisoners was dragged past his observation deck, their defiant shouts mixing with the metallic clang of restraint collars. For 3 cycles, the hegemony of Outworld warlords had dominated this sector, reducing entire civilizations to commodity entries in their blood markets. The humans fetch premium prices, hissed his lieutenant, Crexmore, his serpentine head swaying, as he consulted the auction manifest. Their endurance in the combat pits exceeds most species by 40%. The Nixari buyers are especially eager. Vex Thul's predatory smile revealed rows of crystalline teeth. The hegemony had perfected the art of civilization harvesting across 17 star systems. First came the orbital bombardment, swift and merciless, crippling planetary defenses. Then the harvester fleets descended, collecting the strongest specimens while leaving the ruins to burn. It was efficient. It was profitable. It had never failed. Schedule the next harvest, Vex Thul rumbled, his massive frame casting shadows across the control room. I want Terra's core world stripped, clean within the lunar cycle. But as he spoke, proximity alarms began shrieking throughout the station. Crexmore's scaled fingers danced across the sensor arrays, his expression shifting from confusion to alarm. My lord, we have an incoming vessel. Single ship, Terran configuration, requesting parley? Vex Thul's laugh was like grinding stone. In 3 cycles of conquest, no defeated species had ever dared approach a hegemony stronghold. 1 ship, let them dock. I'll enjoy demonstrating why their kind belongs in chains. The vessel that docked was unlike anything in the hegemony's extensive databases. Sleek where their ships were brutish, elegant where theirs were imposing. As the airlock cycled open, a single figure emerged, walking with measured steps into the heart of Carathon Station. Commander Kalen Voss stood average height for a human, but something in his bearing made the towering alien guards instinctively step back. His uniform was simple, bearing insignia unknown to hegemony intelligence networks. Most unsettling were his eyes, calm, calculating, holding depths that seemed to assess everything while revealing nothing. I am Commander Voss of the Terran Strategic Command, he announced to the assembled warlords, his voice carrying despite its conversational tone. I've come to discuss the immediate cessation of your harvesting operations. The throne room erupted in inhuman laughter. Vex Thul leaned forward, his massive bulk creating new shadows. You stand before the lords of 17 conquered worlds, human. Your species exists at our pleasure. We own your people, your planets, your very future. Voss's expression didn't change. He reached into his jacket, causing a dozen weapons to track his movement, and withdrew a small device. This is a quantum communicator, linked to every major power in this galactic sector. They're all listening to this conversation. Let them listen to your final words, Vex Thul snarled, rising from his obsidian throne. No, Voss replied calmly. Let them listen to yours. You see, gentlemen, you've made a critical error in your calculations. You've mistaken humanity's restraint for weakness, our diplomacy for fear. You've harvested our colonies, enslaved our people, and assumed we would accept this because we haven't immediately retaliated. The chamber fell silent except for the ambient hum of the station's systems. But there's something you need to understand. About humans, Voss continued, his voice now carrying an edge that made the temperature seem to drop. We're not just another species to be catalogued and conquered. We're something you've never encountered before. We're strategic thinkers who plan not just battles, but wars. Not just campaigns, but the complete restructuring of galactic power. Vex Thul's forearms spread wide in a gesture of dismissal. Empty threats from a dying... 3 minutes ago, Voss interrupted. My signal triggered the activation of 67 sleeper vessels positioned throughout your territory. Each one carries a single human crew and enough firepower to crack the moon. They're now moving toward your most critical installations. The throne room's silence deepened. But that's not the real threat, Voss added with something that might have been a smile. The communications array of Carathon Station erupted into chaos as reports flooded in from across the hegemony's territory. Vexthul's subordinates scrambled between control stations, their various alien physiologies betraying stress in different ways. Color changes, pheromone releases, involuntary vocalizations. Lord Vexthul, chittered communications officer Irextal, his insectoid mandibles clicking rapidly. We're receiving distress signals from the Nexari mining complex, the Draconis shipyards, and, by the Void, 17 other installations. Commander, Voss stood motionless in the center of the mayhem, his hands clasped behind his back, watching the Warlords' carefully constructed empire begin to unravel in real time. His quantum communicator continued its soft, rhythmic pulsing, a heartbeat counting down to something momentous. Impossible, Crexmore hissed, his serpentine form coiling with agitation. Our intelligence networks would have detected such a massive fleet movement. The humans lack the technological sophistication for what? Voss interrupted quietly. For strategic thinking? For long-term planning? For understanding that sometimes the most effective weapon isn't the biggest gun but the most patient mind? Vexthul's crystalline teeth ground audibly. Even if your sleeper vessels exist, they represent a fraction of our military might. The hegemony commands battle fleets that have... The station shuddered. Emergency lighting bathed the throne room in crimson as power fluctuations rippled through the superstructure. On the massive view screen dominating one wall, the image of space around Carathon Station flickered and then stabilized, revealing something that made even the most battle-hardened warlords fall silent. Ships. Hundreds of them. Not the sleek vessels of Voss's initial description, but something far more terrifying. Converted civilian craft, mining vessels, cargo haulers, research ships, all bristling with improvised weapon systems, all bearing the insignia of the Terran Strategic Command. You see, Voss continued conversationally as if discussing weather rather than warfare, while you were busy harvesting our colonies, we were busy learning about you. Every ship you captured, every prisoner you took, every bit of technology, you assumed would be forgotten. It all taught us something about your capabilities, your weaknesses, your predictable patterns. Irextal's compound eyes bulged as new reports cascaded across his screens. My lord, the converted vessels, they're not attacking our installations, they're surrounding them, creating siege perimeters. A siege. Vexthul's massive form shifted, confusion replacing arrogance. What is the purpose of... The purpose, Voss explained patiently, is to demonstrate a fundamental difference between human warfare and your harvesting operations. You strike fast, hit hard, and move on. It's effective for conquest, but it leaves you vulnerable to a different kind of strategy entirely. He gestured toward the view screen where more vessels continued to emerge from hyperspace, not in attack formations, but in precise coordinated patterns that spoke of months, perhaps years of preparation. This isn't an invasion, Warlord Vexthul. This is what humans call aggressive negotiations. Every single one of your critical installations is now under lockdown. No ships in, no ships out. No supplies, no reinforcements, no communication with your scattered fleets. Crexmore's scales rippled with colors indicating extreme agitation. You cannot maintain such a blockade indefinitely. The logistical requirements, alone, would be insurmountable for a species that thinks in terms of raids and quick strikes, Voss agreed. But humans have been conducting siege warfare for millennia. We understand patience, we understand logistics. We understand that sometimes the most devastating victory comes not from destroying your enemy, but from making them destroy themselves. The quantum communicator pulsed again, and Voss lifted it briefly. Phase 2 is now active, he announced, to his unseen audience. Across the hegemony's territory, the siege fleets weren't just maintaining blockades, they were broadcasting every frequency, every communication channel, Every data stream was now carrying the same message in dozens of languages. Recordings of hegemony atrocities, documented evidence of the blood markets, testimonials from survivors of the harvesting operations. What we're broadcasting, Voss explained as the warlords watched their own crimes played back in high definition, is the truth about your empire. Every species you've enslaved, every world you've broken, every family you've torn apart. The galactic community is seeing it all right now, in detail they've never had access to before. Vexthul's forearms trembled with rage. Propaganda changes nothing. Fear is what maintains order in this galaxy, not moral outrage. Is it? Voss asked mildly. Because right now, 12 different species are mobilizing their defense fleets. The Altair Consortium has frozen all trade agreements with hegemony-controlled space. The Zephyrian Council is offering citizenship and protection to any of your former slaves who can reach their territory. He paused, letting the implications sink in. You built your empire on the assumption that the galaxy would remain fragmented, afraid, unwilling to unite against a common threat. But humans have a talent for inspiration, Warlord. We excel at taking desperate situations and turning them into rallying cries. The next 18 hours transformed Carathon Station from the beating heart of a galactic empire into a tomb of fading ambitions. Reports cascaded in with relentless precision. The Nexari mining complex had ceased all shipments to hegemony worlds. The Draconis shipyards were surrounded by a combined fleet of 7 different species, and most catastrophically, the slave. Markets on 3 different worlds had been liberated by coordinated uprisings. Commander Voss had not moved from his position in the throne room. He stood like a monument to patience, occasionally lifting his quantum communicator to receive updates, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding around him. The warlords had initially assumed this was psychological warfare, but, as the hours passed, a more unsettling truth emerged. He genuinely wasn't concerned about his safety. The uprisings aren't random, reported Irextal, his compound eyes reflecting data streams that told an increasingly dire story. They're coordinated, precise, targeting specific infrastructure while avoiding civilian casualties. Someone provided them with detailed intelligence about our security protocols. Vexthul's massive form had not left his obsidian throne, but his crystalline teeth had worn grooves in the armrests from his constant grinding. Sleeper agents, you've had operatives embedded in our territory for how long? Long enough, Voss replied simply. Every world you've conquered, every population you've enslaved, every harvesting operation you've conducted, you've been watched, recorded, and analyzed. Did you really think that in 3 cycles of systematic atrocities, no one would be taking notes? The view screen flickered to show the space around Carathon Station, where the impromptu siege fleet had been joined by something far more ominous. Sleek predatory vessels bearing the markings of the Altair Consortium, the bristling weapon platforms of the Zephyrian Defense Corps, and the elegant but deadly ships of at least 6 other major powers. The galaxy's most powerful civilizations are now in our star system, Crexmore observed, his serpentine form coiled with tension. This was your plan from the beginning, to unite them against us. Not against you specifically, Voss corrected. Against the idea of you. The concept that strength alone determines who lives and who dies, who rules and who serves. You've become a symbol, Warlord Vexthul, a representation of everything these civilizations have spent centuries trying to evolve beyond. Vexthul finally rose from his throne, his forearms spreading wide in a gesture that once would have intimidated entire planetary councils. You speak of evolution, but you've brought fleets capable of exterminating every living being on this station. How is that different from what we do? Because, Voss said, pulling up holographic displays that showed the deployment patterns of the assembled fleets. None of those ships have weapons targeted at this station. Despite having the firepower to reduce Carathon to space dust, they're maintaining defensive positions. They're here to witness, not to destroy. The quantum communicator pulsed and Voss lifted it once more. Phase 3 is authorized. Across the assembled fleet, Every ship began broadcasting simultaneously, but these weren't propaganda messages or demands for surrender. They were offers, detailed proposals for amnesty, rehabilitation programs, economic integration opportunities, and most remarkably, invitations to join a new galactic coalition based on cooperation rather than conquest. "We're offering every member of your empire a choice," Voss explained as the transmissions continued. "Continue serving a regime built on suffering, or help us build something better. What you're seeing isn't just military might, it's the infrastructure for a new kind of galactic community." Urextal's mandibles clicked frantically as his screen showed response data. "My lord, we're receiving replies from our subordinate commanders. They're accepting the offers. 17 installations have already surrendered, and their personnel are requesting political asylum." The throne room fell silent except for the hum of life support systems and the distant vibration of ships maneuvering in space. Vexthul stared at the view screen, watching his empire dissolve not through conquest, but through defection. "This is impossible," he whispered. "Fear is the only constant in this galaxy. Without it, without strength, there is only chaos." "Is there?" Voss asked gently. "Or is that just what you've always believed because it justified everything you've done? Look at your screen, Warlord. Look at what's happening out there." The view screen now showed something unprecedented in galactic history. Dozens of species working together, sharing resources, coordinating relief efforts for freed slaves, establishing communication protocols between civilizations that had never cooperated before. It was messy, complicated, and imperfect, but it was functional. "Humans understand something that your species apparently doesn't," Voss continued. "True strength isn't the ability to dominate others. It's the ability to inspire others to stand with you willingly. What you're witnessing is the birth of the first truly voluntary galactic alliance." Crexmore's scales had shifted to colors indicating something beyond fear, a kind of existential confusion. But without a controlling hierarchy, without clear dominant structures, how can such an alliance maintain order? "The same way any partnership works," Voss replied. "Through mutual benefit, shared goals, and the understanding that everyone involved is better off together than apart. It requires trust, communication, and occasionally, the willingness to admit when you're wrong." He gestured toward the assembled fleet. "Every ship out there is here by choice. Every captain out there believes that what we're doing is worth the risk. That's not fear-based compliance, that's voluntary cooperation. And historically speaking, voluntary cooperation has always proven more resilient than imposed order." The hegemony's central command network was failing in ways that no military strategist had ever theorized. Not through overwhelming force or technological superiority, but through mass voluntary departure. Across 17 star systems, entire fleets were simply leaving, not defecting to enemy forces, not surrendering under duress, but walking away from an empire that had suddenly lost its fundamental justification for existence. Commander Voss observed this unprecedented dissolution with the patience of someone who had spent years preparing for exactly this moment. His quantum communicator had gone silent. Phase 3 was self-executing now, requiring no further human intervention. "The Draconis shipyards have declared independence," Urextal reported, his compound eyes reflecting data streams that painted an increasingly surreal picture. "They're requesting membership in the new coalition. The Nexari Mining Consortium is offering to share their resource extraction technologies with any species willing to guarantee worker rights. Even our most loyal battle commanders are asking questions." Vexthul had not moved from his throne in over 6 hours, his massive frame seemingly carved from the same obsidian as his seat. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note that no one in the throne room had ever heard before: uncertainty. "You've destroyed something that took 3 cycles to build," he said slowly. "An empire, a system, an order that brought stability to this entire sector. Did it?" Voss asked quietly. Or did it bring the appearance of stability through the suppression of everything that makes civilizations actually thrive? Trade, cultural exchange, scientific cooperation, artistic development, all the things that were forbidden under your regime are now flourishing in the space of a single day. The view screen now showed something that would have been impossible under hegemony rule: ships from different species working together to establish communication relays, sharing medical supplies, exchanging cultural databases. It was chaotic. Yes, but it was the chaos of growth rather than the silence of oppression. The Kepler Research Station has published their findings on quantum fold technology, Irextal continued, his voice growing more bewildered with each report. They kept their breakthrough secret under our rule, but now they're sharing it freely. The Andorian agricultural worlds are offering seed varieties that could end food scarcity on 7 different planets. It's like they were all waiting for permission to help each other. Crexmore's serpentine form had coiled into a tight spiral, a defensive posture his species adopted when confronting incomprehensible concepts. But without central authority, without clear hierarchies, how do they resolve disputes? How do they prevent conflicts? They talk to each other. Voss replied with what might have been amusement. Revolutionary concept, I know. Instead of having a warlord decide who lives and dies, they've established mediation councils, trade arbitration panels, and cooperative resource management committees. It's messier than totalitarian rule, but it's also more resilient. The quantum communicator pulsed once briefly. Voss glanced at it and nodded to himself before addressing the assembled warlords. That was confirmation that the last of your slave markets has been shut down. Every being held in bondage under hegemony authority is now free. The rehabilitation centers are reporting they need more supplies than anticipated. Apparently, most of your former slaves are choosing to stay in coalition space, rather than return to their homeworlds. Vexthul's 4 arms moved for the first time in hours, not in threatening gestures, but in something resembling confusion. They choose to stay with their former captors rather than return home. They choose to stay with people who gave them back their freedom, Voss corrected. There's a difference. Many of them are joining the construction crews building the new communication networks. Others are sharing their knowledge of their homeworlds to help establish trade relationships. A few have even volunteered to serve as cultural ambassadors. Hey, paused, letting the implications settle. What you're witnessing is what happens when beings are given actual choices rather than the illusion of choice. When they're treated as partners rather than resources. When their knowledge and skills are valued rather than just their capacity for labor. The throne room's silence stretched until it was broken by an unexpected sound. Irextal laughing. Not the harsh amusement of predators, but something that sounded almost delighted. "My lord," he said, his mandibles clicking with what appeared to be excitement. "The scientific exchanges. They're requesting our participation. Our research data on hyperspace navigation, our mineral extraction techniques, our biological databases. They want to include them in the Coalition's knowledge-sharing protocols." Vexthul's crystalline teeth stopped grinding. "They want our knowledge, even after everything," Voss confirmed. That's the thing about cooperation-based systems. They're inclusive by design. They assume that everyone has something valuable to contribute, even former enemies. Especially former enemies, actually, because you've learned things that peaceful civilizations haven't had to learn. Crexmore raised his serpentine head, scales shifting to colors indicating deep thought. "You're offering us membership in this coalition you've created?" "We're offering you a choice," Voss replied. "The same choice we've offered everyone else. Continue operating as you have, increasingly isolated as the galaxy moves in a different direction, or join something larger than any single empire. Help build something that benefits everyone instead of just the strongest." The view screen flickered again, showing the space around Carathon Station. The siege fleet had reorganized into something that looked less like a military blockade and more like a massive construction project. Ships were sharing resources, establishing permanent communication links and beginning the framework for what appeared to be a permanent diplomatic station. "The galaxy is changing, Warlord," Voss said quietly. "The question is whether you'll change with it or be left behind by it." The transformation of Carathon Station from a slave market hub to the site of the galaxy's first multi-species diplomatic conference occurred with a speed that defied every strategic model in hegemony. Databases. Within 72 hours, the station's holding pens had been converted into conference facilities, its auction blocks transformed into cultural exchange centers, and its command throne room repurposed as a chamber for galactic mediation. Vex Thul stood at the massive viewport that had once showcased his empire's territorial holdings, now displaying something far more complex: a three-dimensional representation of trade routes, communication networks, and cooperative agreements spreading across the galaxy like a living organism. The old boundaries meant nothing. The new connections meant everything. The hegemony as a political entity ceased to exist 14 hours ago, reported Irextal, though his tone had shifted from despair to something resembling fascination. "The last of our territorial governors formally transferred authority to coalition oversight committees. But the infrastructure, the knowledge, the personnel, they're all being integrated into the new system." Commander Voss had finally moved. From his vigil position, now standing beside a holographic display, showing real-time data flows between formerly isolated civilizations, the quantum communicator had been replaced by something far more sophisticated: a multi-species communication protocol that allowed instantaneous translation and cultural context sharing between dozens of different forms of consciousness. "Integration is a better word than dissolution," he agreed. "Your empire had valuable resources, not just material ones, but institutional knowledge about large-scale organization, resource management, and yes, even conflict resolution. The difference is that now that knowledge serves everyone, rather than just the hegemony." Crexmore had shed his coiled defensive posture, his serpentine form now stretched to its full length as he studied the incoming data streams. The efficiency metrics are unexpected. Resource distribution has increased by 47%, while waste has decreased by 32%. Cooperative systems are outperforming hierarchical ones by significant margins. "Cooperation tends to be more efficient than coercion," Voss observed. "When beings choose to contribute rather than being forced to comply, they tend to contribute more thoughtfully, more creatively, and more sustainably." The viewport shifted to show the rehabilitation centers that had replaced the slave markets. But these weren't just medical facilities. They had become learning centers, cultural exchange, hubs, and innovation laboratories. Former slaves were working alongside former guards, not in some forced reconciliation, but in genuine collaborative projects. "That's the aspect I still don't understand," Vexthul admitted, his voice carrying none of its former authority but more genuine curiosity than he had displayed in decades. "The forgiveness, the willingness to work with those who cause them such suffering." "It's not about forgiveness," Voss replied carefully. "It's about choosing the future over the past. Many of those beings understand something that took humanity centuries to learn: that revenge might feel satisfying, but cooperation actually solves problems." He gestured toward a specific section of the display, showing a former hegemony torture specialist now working with xenobiologists to develop new medical treatments. That individual spent 2 years inflicting pain on captured beings. Now he's using that knowledge of alien physiology to help develop universal medical protocols. His victims had the choice to demand his punishment or request his expertise. They chose expertise. "But surely some demanded justice?" Crexmore asked, his scales displaying colors of deep confusion. "Justice, yes. Punishment, not necessarily. The Coalition has established truth and reconciliation councils based on human historical models. Individuals must acknowledge their actions, understand the harm they caused, and contribute to repairing that harm. But the focus is on restoration rather than retribution. Rex Tal's mandibles clicked as new information flowed across his screens. The productivity reports from the former slave worlds are extraordinary. Agricultural output has increased by 60%. Technological development has accelerated by 200%. And most remarkably, several worlds are now net exporters of knowledge rather than just raw materials. The irony was not lost on any of them. The hegemony had viewed these worlds as sources of labor and resources, never recognizing their potential as centers of innovation and culture. Now, freed from oppression, they were becoming some of the coalition's most valuable contributors. This is what you meant about choice, Vexthul said slowly. Not just the choice to leave or stay, but the choice of what to contribute, how to grow, what to become. Exactly, Voss confirmed. Under your system, a being's value was determined by their physical strength, their endurance, their compliance. Under the coalition system, value is determined by what each individual chooses to offer, and those offerings are far more diverse and valuable than anyone anticipated. The quantum communicator chimed softly. Voss glanced at it and smiled, the first genuine expression of pleasure anyone in the room had seen from him. The Terran Council has just approved the establishment of the first permanent coalition embassy on Earth. 57 species will have diplomatic representation in humanity's capital system. The invitation extends to former hegemony leadership as well. He looked directly at Vexthul. You've spent 3 cycles learning how to conquer civilizations. The coalition could use that knowledge, not to dominate, but to understand how civilizations can better defend themselves, how to identify and prevent the conditions that make conquest possible, how to build systems that are resilient against future threats. Vexthul's 4 arms moved in a gesture that his species used to indicate deep thought. You're offering me a position in this coalition, after everything? We're offering you the same thing we've offered everyone else, the chance to choose who you want to be going forward, rather than being defined by who you were in the past. The former warlord turned back to the viewport, watching ships from dozens of species working together in patterns of cooperation that would have been impossible under any hierarchical system. For the first time in his long life, he was contemplating a future built on possibility rather than conquest. 6 months after the dissolution of the hegemony, Carathon Station had become something unprecedented in galactic history, a fully integrated, multi-species habitat where former enemies collaborated daily on projects that benefited the entire galaxy. The transformation was so complete that visiting dignitaries often struggled to believe it had ever been anything else. Vexthul stood in what had once been his throne room, now converted into the Coalition's primary strategic planning center. The obsidian throne had been replaced by a circular amphitheater where representatives from 43 different species could participate in decisions as equals. No elevated positions, no symbols of dominance, just beings working together to solve complex problems. The Nexari Mining Consortium has completed the first phase of the atmospheric rehabilitation project on Kepler 442b, reported Ambassador Erextal. His title had changed along with everything else. The planet will be habitable for 17 different species within the next solar cycle. More importantly, the terraforming techniques developed there are being shared freely with any world that needs them. Commander Voss, now serving as the Coalition's Director of Strategic Integration, studied the holographic displays showing the ripple effects of cooperative development. What had begun as an emergency response to hegemony oppression had evolved into something far more sophisticated, a galaxy-wide network of mutual support that was accelerating development beyond anyone's projections. The economic indicators continue to exceed our models, added Crexmore, whose serpentine form now bore the insignia of the Coalition's Resource Optimization Council. When beings are free to pursue their interests and talents, productivity doesn't just increase, it transforms entirely. We're seeing innovations that would have been impossible under centralized control. The view screen showed a real-time map of the galaxy, but instead of territorial boundaries, it displayed relationship networks, Trade routes, cultural exchanges, scientific collaborations, and diplomatic connections formed a web of interdependence that was both more complex and more stable than any empire. The most remarkable change isn't in the numbers, Voss observed. It's in the problems we're solving. Under the hegemony, the primary challenge was maintaining control. Under the coalition, we're addressing challenges that hierarchical systems can't even perceive. Things like optimization across multiple species needs, development strategies that benefit everyone simultaneously, conflict prevention through mutual investment. Vexthul nodded slowly. His role as strategic defense coordinator had initially seemed like exile disguised as employment, but had evolved into something he found surprisingly fulfilling. Instead of planning conquests, he now analyzed potential threats to the coalition and developed responses that strengthened rather than weakened the network of relationships. The Outer Rim territories have reported contact with 3 previously unknown civilizations, he announced, his 4 arms moving across holographic interfaces with practiced efficiency. Based on our integration protocols, first contact teams are already en route with cultural specialists, trade negotiators, and defense coordinators. If these civilizations prove compatible with coalition principles, we could have 3 new members within the year. And if they prove hostile? Asked Ambassador Erextal, though without the fear such questions had once carried. Then we apply the Carathon protocols, Voss replied calmly. Demonstrate the benefits of cooperation while maintaining the capability to defend against aggression. Most importantly, we offer their populations the same choices we offered everyone else. The Carathon protocols had emerged from the coalition's early experiences, integrating former hegemony territories. Rather than conquest or conversion, they emphasized patient demonstration of alternative possibilities, protection for beings who chose cooperation, and defensive strategies that didn't require offensive actions. The protocols have a 93% success rate, Crexmore noted with satisfaction. Even civilizations that initially approach us with hostile intent tend to join the coalition once they understand what membership offers. It's not magic, Voss cautioned. It's just the logical result of offering people something better than what they have. Most aggression stems from scarcity, fear, or the belief that dominance is the only path to security. When you can demonstrate abundance, safety, and mutual benefit, aggression becomes much less appealing. The chamber's central display shifted to show long-term projections. Unlike the territorial expansion maps that had once dominated hegemony planning, these showed development timelines, quality of life improvements, and technological advancement curves that benefited all member species simultaneously. The 20-year projections suggest we'll have effective solutions to resource scarcity, interspecies disease, and even conflict prevention, Vexthul observed with something approaching wonder. Problems that have plagued this galaxy for millennia, solved through cooperation rather than conquest. The most important projection isn't on that display, Voss added quietly. It's the generational one. Children growing up in coalition space won't think in terms of us versus them. They'll think in terms of what can we build together. That's the real transformation, not just changing how civilizations interact, but changing how they think about interaction itself. Ambassador Erextal's compound eyes reflected the data streams in patterns that suggested deep contemplation. You're describing a permanent change in galactic civilization, not just politics or economics, but consciousness itself. Every generation builds on the assumptions of the previous one, Voss confirmed. For centuries, those assumptions included the belief that strength meant dominance, that security required the ability to destroy enemies, that prosperity was a zero-sum game. We're giving the next generation different assumptions to build on. Vexthul moved to the viewport, looking out at the construction of the coalition's first mobile diplomatic platform, a massive vessel designed to carry the infrastructure for establishing cooperative relationships with civilizations anywhere in the galaxy. I spent 3 cycles building an empire based on fear, he said quietly. Now I'm helping build something based on hope, The strange thing is, hope turns out to be far more powerful than fear ever was. Hope is just fear transformed, Voss replied. Fear of scarcity becomes hope for abundance. Fear of isolation becomes hope for connection. Fear of meaninglessness becomes hope for contribution. You didn't abandon your nature, Vexthul. You found a better way to express it. The former warlord considered this, his crystalline teeth no longer grinding with frustration but set in something resembling determination. Then let's build something worth hoping for. 2 years after the Carathon transformation, as historians had begun calling it, Commander Voss stood on the observation deck of the CSS Unity, the Coalition's flagship diplomatic vessel, watching. Something that would have been inconceivable under any previous galactic order. Below them, representatives from over 100 species were gathered not for conquest or surrender, but for the Second Galactic Cooperation Summit. The venue itself told the story of how thoroughly everything had changed. Instead of a single world hosting the summit under its own authority, the gathering was taking place aboard a massive mobile platform constructed cooperatively by 17 different civilizations. Each section reflected different architectural, philosophies, environmental needs, and cultural preferences, yet the whole structure functioned as a unified system. The attendance exceeded our most optimistic projections, reported Vexthul, his role having evolved into something between strategic advisor and galactic historian. We have confirmed representatives from 143 civilizations, including 27 that first contacted us within the last year. Ambassador Urextal's compound eyes reflected satisfaction as he reviewed the summit's preliminary agreements. The resource-sharing protocols alone will eliminate scarcity-based conflicts for the next century, but more importantly, we're seeing the emergence of what the cultural analysts are calling collaborative consciousness, species beginning to think collectively about galactic challenges rather than just local ones. The transformation was visible everywhere. The platform's central amphitheater hosted debates where former enemies worked together to solve problems that affected everyone. The cultural exchange sectors buzzed with activities that were creating entirely new forms of art, science, and philosophy. Most remarkably, the conflict resolution centers were training beings from across the galaxy in techniques that made war increasingly obsolete. The Draconian Syndicate arrived yesterday, Crexmore reported, his serpentine form displaying colors of cautious optimism. They were the last major holdout, a militaristic hierarchy that swore they would never submit to what they called the weakness of cooperation. But their younger generation forced a governmental transition. They're here seeking full membership. Voss nodded, unsurprised. It had become a pattern, established hierarchies resisting the coalition while their populations increasingly demanded access to its benefits. The result was usually internal reform, rather than external conquest. Societies changing themselves to become compatible with the larger galactic community. Any civilization that maintains internal freedom and external cooperation is welcome, Voss stated, reciting what had become the Coalition's fundamental principle. The Draconians will find their place here, just as everyone else has. The observation deck's main display showed real-time data from across the galaxy. Trade volumes that would have been impossible under territorial restrictions, scientific breakthroughs emerging from multi-species collaboration, cultural innovations that were enriching billions of lives. But the most significant statistic was the simplest. The galaxy had experienced 0 major conflicts in 22 consecutive months. 0 wars, Vexthul mused, still finding the concept difficult to grasp completely. In 3 millennia of recorded galactic history, there has never been a period of such extended peace. Peace isn't the absence of conflict, Voss corrected gently. It's the presence of justice. When beings have what they need, when they feel heard and valued, when they can see a path to a better future through cooperation rather than competition, conflict becomes unnecessary. Through the viewport, they could see the most ambitious project yet undertaken by any galactic civilization. The construction of the Nexus, a permanent diplomatic and cultural center positioned at the galaxy's gravitational Center, designed to serve as humanity's gift to the galactic community, not a seat of power, but a meeting place where any being from any world could participate in decisions that affected everyone. The human delegation received an interesting proposal this morning, Ambassador Irextal announced, his mandibles clicking, with what sounded like amusement. 47 different species have formally requested that Earth be designated as the galaxy's neutral ground, a place where any being can seek refuge, mediation, or simply a new beginning. Voss smiled at that, remembering the terrified, defiant prisoners he had seen in Carathon Station's holding pens 2 years earlier. Earth would be honored by such a designation, though I suspect most humans would prefer to be remembered not as rulers or protectors, but as the species that helped prove cooperation was possible. The summit's closing ceremony was scheduled to begin within the hour, but its conclusions were already evident in the countless small interactions happening throughout the platform. Beings who had never communicated before were establishing permanent, diplomatic relationships. Scientists were forming research partnerships that crossed not just species boundaries, but evolutionary classifications. Artists were creating works that could be appreciated by multiple sensory systems simultaneously. The most remarkable achievement isn't what we've built, Vex Thul observed, watching a group of young beings from dozens of different species working together on what appeared to be a new form of mathematics. It's what we've proven possible. Every child growing up in coalition space will assume that cooperation is normal, that diversity is strength, that problems are solved through collaboration rather than domination. And every potential tyrant will have to contend with a galaxy that has learned it doesn't need tyrants, Crexmore added, his scales displaying patterns of deep satisfaction. The closing ceremony began with something unprecedented, a moment of silence for all the beings who had died under the old systems. Not just victims, but perpetrators too, beings who had lived and died without ever knowing that better possibilities existed. It was a recognition that the transformation had been purchased with countless tragedies, and that remembering those tragedies was essential to preventing their repetition. Then came the reading of the Galactic Compact, not a treaty between separate powers, but a commitment by all participants to maintain the principles that had made their cooperation possible: freedom of choice, voluntary association, mutual aid, cooperative problem-solving, and the fundamental recognition that every conscious being had something valuable to contribute. As the ceremony concluded, Voss found himself thinking about the moment 2 years earlier, when he had walked into Carathon Station carrying nothing but a quantum communicator and a plan that most would have considered impossibly optimistic. The plan had worked, not because humans were superior, but because they had recognized something that all species were capable of: the choice to be better than their worst impulses. The hegemony ruled through fear because fear seemed eternal, he said quietly to his companions. But fear was just the absence of better options. Once better options existed, fear became irrelevant. The CSS Unity began its journey toward the next diplomatic mission: contact with a recently discovered civilization in the outer spiral. The process had become routine: patient demonstration of benefits, protection for those who chose cooperation, defense preparations that emphasized security without aggression, and most importantly, the simple offer that had transformed the galaxy: join. In building something better than any of us could build alone. As the stars shifted in the viewport and the platform continued its work behind them, Voss reflected on humanity's true contribution to galactic civilization. Not superior technology or military might, but a simple recognition that conscious beings were capable of choosing cooperation over competition, hope over fear, and the future over the past. The galaxy had learned that its greatest strength was not in any single species or empire, but in the connections between all its peoples. And in learning that lesson, it had discovered something that would echo through the ages. The universe was not a place of scarcity to be fought over, but a place of infinite possibility to be explored together. The age of warlords was over. The age of cooperation had begun, and it would last as long as beings chose to make it last, which, as it turned out, was exactly as long as it needed to.